You can watch Arsenal versus Burnley and Man City versus Crystal Palace on Now TV for just €10. So what's stopping you? Putting up more Christmas decorations? Your house already looks like Santa's grotto. A family party? Your Aunt Mary has seen you 4 times this week already. Don't let anything get in your way. To treat yourself to a Now TV Sky Sports Day Pass and watch the games that matter to you for just €10, search Now TV Football today. Content streamed by internet. Full terms at nowtv.com.
For an entire generation, people have experienced Star Wars the only way it's been possible, on the TV screen. But if you've only seen it this way, you haven't seen it at all.
This is the podcast you're looking for.
We've been waiting for you.
I'm Joe Schreiber, author of Maul-Lockdown, and you're listening to Coffee with Kenobi with Dan Zub and Corey Clubb, and this is the podcast you're looking for.
Your insight serves you well.
We would like to welcome Joe Schreiber as our special guest. Joe is the author of the upcoming Maul-Lockdown, an exciting and intense new novel that Star Wars fans are looking forward to reading. The book will be available on January 28th and places Maul in a space penitentiary that houses the galaxy's worst criminals, where convicts face off in gladiatorial combat. Joe has agreed to join Corey and me for a cup of coffee, and we are very excited to have him. Welcome, Joe.
Thanks. It's great to be here with you guys.
Absolutely. Well, we are delighted to have you to share a cup of coffee with us. And Maul-Lockdown is a book that a lot of fans are going to go wild over. Corey and I had the luxury of getting an advanced copy and previewing it, and it is worth every second of waiting that all these Darth Maul fans have in store for them. So we're excited.
Thanks, Dan. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and Joe, this isn't your first Star Wars novel. You've been a writer for quite some time, and we're curious about your background as a writer. Could you give us a little insight to that?
Sure. Well, I mean, I kind of always knew that I wanted to write. I mean, literally from as far back as I can remember. I'm old enough to remember the age before home video. So what I had was a movie camera, essentially, and a notebook, and sort of eventually ended up just writing. Sometime around 5th or 6th grade, I decided I was just going to start writing short stories, and it was just of a weird enough kind of enthusiasm that my friends thought it was kind of interesting, and we ended up sort of writing and drawing comics together, and gradually I gravitated more toward the writing side of it, and always kind of stuck with it. Never really thought whether or not I was actually going to get anything published, but mainly just did it for the enjoyment of writing stories. So I've always sort of had an enthusiasm for it.
That's really neat. And Corey is a writer himself. I teach high school literature and writing, so
nice.
It's interesting. When you were in high school, did you like to write, or is that something that maybe how did you lean towards? How were you in academics when it came to writing?
You know, it was always kind of the redheaded stepchild of my writing. I was always much more of a fiction writer than I was an essay or a school writer. I mean, I didn't mind writing papers for school, and I certainly enjoyed some of the books that I got to read when I was in school. But to me, it was never the same sort of charge that I got when I would write a short story. And even back then, my heroes were guys like Harlan Ellison and Ray Bradbury, just short story writers who were very obviously really passionate about just the act of writing. So I always took that part of it pretty seriously, even if what I was writing was junk, which it was a lot of the time at the beginning. I still, got a real kick out of just putting the words down on paper. And, occasionally there was the really kind of scary part where you'd show it to somebody and see what they thought. But even if I didn't, just the act of doing it felt kind of courageous at the time. And it was just something that I was really excited about even back then.
And this just pops into my head now, knowing that, of course, kind of some of the feel and the tone of Maul-Lockdown and some of your other books. And now that I know that we're big into short stories by Bradbury and the greats like that, how were you on Edgar Allan Poe?
Poe was somebody that I didn't really come to until a little bit later in life, actually. I think it wasn't until college that I really kind of got past my initial, his language was not quite as accessible as guys like Richard Matheson. And I knew Poe was great, and I knew that he was kind of twisted and he had a dark sensibility, but I came to it later on. And of course, all the really good Poe short stories are fairly short. Like they're not long stories. So once you start, you're just like, this is something that I could just devour. And since then, I've certainly gone back and read and reread a lot of them. But it took me a little bit to get to that point.
Good point. Is the vocabulary and the better one seems like the better stories he has are the shorter ones.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. I agree. Well, since this is a Star Wars podcast, how did you get involved in writing for Star Wars? As we know that Lockdown is not your first Star Wars novel.
Right. I had the really good fortune of having a couple of horror novels, sort of mainstream standalone horror novels published by Del Rey Ballantyne, probably back in the mid-2000s. And my editor there, Keith Clayton, who was an editor at the time, was also really involved in the whole expanded universe. And eventually sort of came up with this crazy idea of what if we did a Star Wars horror novel. And I was so excited about that. I was just like, absolutely. Like if that ever turned into a reality, I think it started out as a conversation at a bar, at a convention somewhere some night. They were talking about how cool it would be to do that. And my name came up as an opportunity to give it a chance. And I was so thrilled to even have that opportunity that I just kind of jumped headlong straight into it and never looked back.
Well, I remember too the buzz when there was among the fan community that there was going to be a Star Wars horror novel and the excitement that generated from that as well.
Yeah, it was a little bit divisive. I think a lot of people liked it, but then there was definitely people who were just, I remember the day the book came out, I was visiting a friend in LA and we went to the bookstore and they had it up in front and center. And there was a guy just ripping into it. Like he had no idea that he was standing next to me and my friend. And he was like, this is absurd. This is horrible. I can't believe that they're doing this. And we ended up getting into a long conversation, my friend and I, with this guy, just trying to figure out I really wanted to hear what his point of view on it. Cause he obviously took very seriously. He wasn't even necessarily a Star Wars fan. His whole idea was, he was coming at it from the point of culture itself is becoming more and more corrupt, and here's Exhibit A. And he just sort of had the book out. And it was really interesting to have that be one of the first responses to the book. Because up until then, I generally stay off the forums and stuff online. I try not to even really go there. But it was interesting to have, this is a face-to-face conversation with somebody who really had an issue with the book. Certainly a lot of people really liked it as well. But it was interesting that they chose to go with the cover art that they did, which is, very overtly this is a horror novel. They hired the guys who did the Saw movie posters to do the cover for Death Troopers.
Oh, you're kidding.
Oh, cool.
And you can tell, it was sort of a call to arms. This is the kind of book it's going to be. And so, regardless of how people ended up feeling about it, I felt it's a very honest, it's pretty honest about what it's going to be like. You pick it up, what kind of book you're going to be getting into. So it was interesting to see the different reactions people had to it, certainly.
If you could go back, would you have changed the cover?
No, I was very pleased with it. For me, what it was a sort of as a validation of originally they want to do a George Romero type story in a George Lucas universe, and I guess they were serious. When I saw the cover, I was like, well, if Lucasfilm's okay with this, then I certainly feel like I can go wherever this story needs to go and not worry about it being too much of whatever. So no, I was very glad that they sort of took that route, actually, instead of kind of holding back on it.
And we must say that this Maul-Lockdown is a little less horrific than your other stories too. I personally enjoyed it very much, and I was curious to know how did Lockdown come about?
It came about kind of in a weird way, similarly to the way Death Troopers came about, which was just through a very fortuitous email from Del Rey Books. My editor, Frank Parisi, who's the editor for Maul, sort of just shot me an email one day, and it's probably almost 3 years ago now. And he said, how would you feel about a Maul prison novel? And that was it. It was kind of just a one-line thing.
That's cool.
But immediately, my imagination started running wild because I'm a big fan of prison movies. The whole genre, I think, has got a ton of potential, character-wise and sort of story-wise. You've got a confined environment, and of course, you've got the prison barge and Death Troopers. So it's sort of a similar thing, but this was going to be a bigger examination of what that environment looked like. And to have Darth Maul put into it was just, I don't know. I just felt like the pinball machine just hit tilt there as far as all the different ways you could go with his character. Developing it in that environment. I was already very excited about doing it, even before I knew what I was going to do.
That's great. And I think, too, as far as the book goes, you said the setting of a prison setting. It's something, like you said, we really haven't seen a whole lot in Star Wars. It's grittier, it's darker. Mm-hmm. I think, too, what were some of your researches for those kind of things?
Well, the coolest thing about a project like this is you can call all kinds of things research. I got to just go back and watch some of my favorite prison movies again. I like just stuff like Escape from Alcatraz, or even that TV show Prison Break, or just anything that gives you an opportunity to look at who ends up in prison, how they got there, and just all the different types of archetypes and how they interact. And certainly you don't want to exclude people who are going to be sympathetic characters. I mean, there are characters in Maul-Lockdown that have real, hopefully sympathetic relationships that the reader can sort of identify with. There's a father and son character.
Certainly.
There's other characters there that have, they're in prison, and yes, they've made some really, maybe poor choices that landed them there. But what is it about their relationships that resonate with us as readers? Like, why should we care? Why are we not just waiting around for the next fight scene? But what's compelling us through all these different character stories, sort of within this environment? And what were the survival skills that have sort of helped them get to where they are now in such a sort of a desperate place? So research wise, like, I was all over the place. There's just some good nonfiction stuff about prisons out there. Historically, good stuff about what Leavenworth Prison was like and people who've escaped from there. The Panopticon, which was Jeremy Bentham's idea of how a prison should work, where prisoners are all sort of watching each other all the time. I mean, there's just really some cool stuff out there that should have provoked interesting ideas about what this prison could possibly be like.
I think too about the like I said, the prison genre is very interesting to me too. It's because it's confined, it's really unique. I think too there's a lot of cliches about it. How'd you work around your cliches?
I think that's a really good question, because as a writer, I mean, I think a lot of people's tendencies is to go to the cliche first, and that's where a good editor like Frank Perusi and Eric Schoenweiss at Del Rey were really good about pushing past what those initial things were going to be. Like, how are we going to get past what people first think of when they think of sort of a cheesy prison scenario, to the point where, we see real three-dimensional characters here, but also B, when it comes even to Maul, like, how are we going to see him actually in a tight spot? Like, where are we going to see him in legitimate peril, so that even though we know he's not going to die here, like, how are we going to see him literally pressed to his limits? So what he's gone through in the past is, and his endurance in the past is going to kind of help him get through this, even though any lesser person or individual might have given up in these circumstances, like creating a hot water situation for him where it's really, really desperate, and not just saying, well, as a writer, I know he's going to survive, so I don't want to make it too tough on him, but really pressing that as far as we can within the situation in Cog Hive 7.
Absolutely. Well, and Corey hit it perfectly too. There, you don't run into the cliches of prison, and I think as importantly, especially for a Star Wars fan, you don't run into these. You don't make Darth Maul a one-dimensional character. He's more interesting, and we'll jump to that a little bit later. But I want to talk about the level of violence in the book, and right off the bat, and I'm not going to spoil anything for people who are going to read the book, and you're going to love it. But like just the beginning, the thing with the tooth. Talk about the level of violence. Were there ever times when you thought, I better pull back, or I need to make this a little bit more intense? Because I think for some people who have never read expanded universe novels, it could be an eye-opener. Now, personally, I thought it was fascinating, but I wonder how much was going into the development of that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I never really am consciously aware of holding back. Even with the Death Troopers novel and the sequel to that, I felt like I needed to go where I wanted to. The story, I sort of needed to follow the story where it was going to go. And if in edits some of the things had to be toned back, then we could certainly do that. I just didn't want to be aware that I was like sort of doing an inhibited first draft of sort of the darker ramifications in Death Troopers, or even within the prison situation here. I mean, we're dealing with a series of gladiatorial battles. These battles are to the death, and one of the hazards of that was that it was going to get redundant. Are we just seeing the same sort of fights over and over again? I mean, nothing's more boring than a poorly written, or even for that matter, like a poorly choreographed fight scene in a movie. It just leaves you cold. You feel like the movie is just kind of killing time, and I really didn't want that to happen with this book. I really wanted the violence when it happened to mean something, and the situation you're talking about at the very beginning with the tooth was sort of just like, this is what this book is going to be like. I sort of wanted the reader to know up front that, like, literally, like, there's going to be some physical sort of consequences to this actions. These aren't going to just be these sort of cartoonish fights. And I was really ready to hear, any comments that Del Rey had about, we need to, pull back on this. And I think there were some comments about some of the cannibalism in the book. I mean, some of the inmates, I don't want to give away too much, but
sure,
some of the inmates have teeth that are filed to points, and they really didn't want it to go and become excessive, because after a certain point it becomes numbing as well, and you sort of have the paradoxical effect of sort of isolating and pushing your readers back out because it's gone too far. I really didn't want to do that either. So I was just kind of depending on Frank and Arish at Del Rey to kind of steer me away from that. And they did. They did a really good job, I think, anticipating what the reader's response was going to be. So I was very grateful to them for that.
Absolutely. And honestly, and for people who are going to read this, the pacing of the book in such a way, what you mentioned, Joe, about you don't want, I agree, there's nothing worse than having an action film or a book with a lot of action, but without soul. And you manage to put characters in there that do give you reason to invest. There is a legitimate reason why there's peril for Maul, which we'll talk about later. So I applaud you for doing that because there is a real danger of that possibly happening, and it is completely avoided here.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think we've all been like sitting in a movie theater or watching a video. Your expectations might not be sky high, or they might be, but either way, you're just aware halfway through that you've sort of checked out of the thrust of the story because it's not handled in a way that's sort of saying, we're going to take whatever the stakes are of this story, we're going to take them seriously, we're going to spend time setting them up, and then take time sort of executing what happens next in a way that amplifies the reader's interest, as opposed to like, okay, we've seen this before, we don't need to see this again.
And kind of almost like a Tarantino vibe, really.
Yeah, I think that's a good comparison.
I think too. I'll be honest with you guys, and Dan might know this too. I'm not a huge Darth Maul fan.
I didn't know that. Actually.
Yeah, he's never been my favorite. You don't see him too much in the movies. I'm not really through the Clone Wars yet, so I don't know a whole lot about that arc with him and how he returns and whatnot. Mm-hmm. But I got this title. I was like, oh, this is cool. I knew your name from being the author of some other horror novels of the Star Wars universe. But I got to reading this, and I was like, this is incredible because I never knew this side of Maul. The way you write it and the way you portray it in your words is very well done. I applaud you for that.
Oh,
and
thank you.
We're very curious how you got into his head and how you kind of his thinking and whatnot. Is it more of like a Episode 1 Darth Maul, Clone Wars Maul? What do you see?
That's a really good question. I mean, originally when we started talking about this as a Darth Maul prison novel, that the idea was that it was going to be set more within the Clone Wars time frame, which clearly is a different Maul than the one we've seen in Episode 1. I mean, like you said, you haven't been through all the Clone Wars episodes yet, but they did some really fascinating stuff with his character at the end. And the original conversations that I was having with Del Rey, we sort of saw Maul almost more in his gangster, sort of rising gangster, galactic gangland incarnation, where he's almost this sort of Star Wars universe Tony Montana, rising up from ignominy into this empire that he's building. And how would a character like that end up in prison? Well, clearly it would be a different reason than it would be that he's in prison we ended up with, which is the more Episode 1 Maul. Either one would have been fine with me. I was really excited about the other version, and when we made the decision to kind of steer away from the Clone Wars, it was like, all right, I need to go back and watch Episode 1 again. I don't know how you guys feel about Episode 1, but I mean, for me, the Qui-Gon duel and the whole scene with Maul toward the end there is, you see so much of, I mean, to me, that sort of became the touchstone. Like, what was it that was exciting about that scene? Like, what was it that was just captivating about watching Maul sort of pace back and forth, like an almost like a caged tiger in the middle of that duel? Like, that evoked so much within those few kind of silent moments. I was like, this is why I am excited about Maul as a character, because there's an intensity to him that, even within the intense characters of Star Wars, is almost unique. It's this sort of bottled up intensity. Like, where does that come from? We now know a little bit about his past, but what would that be like to have somebody like that in an environment in a prison? I really felt like that was where I wanted to start from. That quiet intensity that really, you didn't want to hear him monologuing. You didn't want to hear him talking about how evil he was. What you wanted to see was him thinking forward and really just using every aspect of his environment to his advantage. Every second that he's there, perceiving a threat and responding to it, and establishing, just establishing himself as sort of the alpha, figure in these different scenarios that he's in within the prison. And what would that look like for somebody who doesn't talk a lot, but is more just like says what he needs to say, almost just by just being there. He is the threat. He doesn't make a threat. He just physically, by being where he is, like, everything you need to know is right there. It's just that level of intimidation is fascinating to me. And what would that look like to have him be sort of an anti-hero? So all those were questions that I sort of was tackling when I came to him in this book.
That's fascinating. And like I said, as a writer myself, I find that interesting that you went back and watched the movies and watched that last battle scene from episode 1, and just like you said, you watched. I mean, he doesn't talk anything during the fight, and it's all about body language, his intensity, his pacing back and forth. And I applaud you again for getting inside his head and be able to just capture those essences about him and then put it into words. Kudos to you.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think that's a key thing with Darth Maul, because it really in episode 1, and I agree with you, the reasons that the things that are amazing about the Phantom Menace are the points you brought out. But Maul is basically, he's just personification of rage. And the sequence with the tire you talked about. So giving Darth Maul a soul and a focus through characterization that doesn't involve his fists is intriguing. I think we see a lot of that towards the end of the book, which I'm not going to spoil for anyone. I agree with you on that. I think it's probably was a challenge, but how exciting. And was Dave Filoni a big influence on this?
Well, certainly just getting really involved. I came late to Clone Wars, and I started watching it. I have a son who actually turns 12 today, and he and I were watching different episodes of, and not even just the Maul Clone Wars, but just an episode I was discussing with someone just the other day, which was The Box, which was one of my favorite Clone Wars episodes. And I brought it up to my son again. I was like, we were just talking about that episode, The Box. He goes, I was just thinking about that again. That was one of those ones. I just felt like that was a standout. So well done. So well designed as far as the efficiency of the episode. Like, really, you've got 22 or 23 minutes per episode, and really no time is wasted for the most part. They tend to be very, very well structured. Even the ones that are sort of episode to episode continuous, but certainly the ones that are almost more standalone, they work so well. And just their models of efficiency as far as storytelling goes. So in that sense, I felt like Clone Wars was an influence, because ideally this is a sort of book that I would like, obviously adults to read, but also, older kids, fans of Clone Wars would pick it up and just be like, wow, this story doesn't waste time. It doesn't waste the reader's time. It really just carries you along and gives you that sort of escape hatch that pulls you into an area in a story that you don't want to leave. So that I think they do that very well in the Clone Wars as well. So that did sort of influence just the sort of way that the book moved forward.
Be awesome. Well, first, most importantly, happy birthday to your son. What's his name?
Jack.
Well, happy birthday, Jack. Thanks for sharing your dad with us for a real brief time. I want to talk to you really quickly about your decision to prevent Maul from using the Force. Clearly, story-wise, it had to be this way. Otherwise, there wouldn't be as much peril. But was there any trepidation on your part as far as fans wanting to see Sith action? And the reason that inspired this question is when we talked to John Jackson Miller about Kenobi, he said he was a little nervous or reticent that people would want to see more Jedi versus Sith action. And, of course, that's not what that story is about. Mm-hmm. So what did you run into with this decision?
Well, I'll be honest with you. I just the last Star Wars book I wrote, which was a sequel to Death Troopers, which was called Red Harvest, there was a good bit of Sith and Jedi and lightsaber, action in it. And those scenes were fun to write, certainly. There's something almost limiting about that to a certain extent. When you realize this is where you're going to end up. You're going to end up with lightsabers. You're going to end up with Jedi and Sith, sort of in the classic conflict that we've come to know. But with this book, I really felt like, we know who Maul is. We know what he's capable of, both within the book and just in the general Star Wars universe. And so there's a cool sort of dramatic tension that gets built by knowing what he's capable of doing and knowing that he's deliberately showing restraint because he has to, because everything sort of counts on that. I mean, the stakes of the book are that his mission needs to remain secret, and it becomes compromised as soon as he loses that restraint, and he goes ahead and goes forward and uses the Force and tips his hand as to who sent him and who he really is. So I actually felt like that going in. I didn't feel any sort of nervousness about it. More than anything, I felt like, well, this is cool. Like, and this is sort of the sort of thing where I almost see myself as a reader of the book, sitting down and just being like, eventually I know that there's going to be some Sith related stuff. There's going to be some dark side related stuff going on. But in the meantime, like, hopefully the bulk of the book, it's exciting to see him within the restraints that are imposed on him, and how that, how he's forced to become resourceful. That's when I think things can get really fun and creative, actually, is when, okay, we're going to take this off the table for now. Where does that leave us? Where does that take us story-wise when he's not able to do the other things? Where does he have to go? One of the things that we talked about seeing a lot is just him just like building strength, like using just really low-tech ways of building strength within the cell even, just to maintain any edge that he can have, knowing that might make the difference at any time, between winning and losing.
Well, it's probably you talked about him having to show restraint. It wouldn't be as exciting if he was able to just be full Maul all the time. Probably
Right.
similar to what people who write Superman have to deal with, I would think. But I will say for our listeners and readers of the blogs, if you are a Darth Maul fan, you're not going to be disappointed. Darth Maul kicks plenty of butt repeatedly in incredibly creative and unique ways. So. And this is coming from a guy who's seen every episode of The Sopranos and Dexter, and there's a lot of original action and awesomeness in here. So it's pretty awesome.
Thank you.
Well, you talked a little about the pacing of the book, and like I said, from page one, it just takes off, and you're kind of given, basically, this is what's going to be about. This is the way it's going to go, and right from the beginning, we get a great look into what the whole book is going to kind of develop into. But you kind of cut your chapters into like these short little bursts of action and story mixed together. Was that kind of to just set up the pacing, or how did that work for you?
Those tend to be my favorite kind of stories ever since I was a kid. Like I like books with short chapters. I like, cliffhangers. I like books that just propel you forward and just don't let up. I feel like there's enough things competing for our attention now as 21st century human beings that I owe the reader the most like propulsive, slingshot of a reading experience that I can muster. And if that means, shorter chapters and changing viewpoints, and I'm certainly willing to do that, that to me just makes a more exciting reading experience. I feel like there's too many other options. There's too many things that can pull you out of the story. And I really didn't want that to happen if I could possibly help it.
Well, I think that's important too for the pacing of what you're accomplishing with Lockdown. And also there's a bit of an accomplishment too for the reader. I know that trying to get students to read all the time, they're more inclined to gravitate towards something that has shorter chapters, but isn't short on meaning or power and strength. Mm-hmm. And so I didn't know how much that was you or how much that was the editors or both, because it's very effective.
Thank you. Yeah, that just tends to be the way that I write normally. And it has been cool to get response from younger readers. I write books for younger readers as well, like middle grade and young adult, that the Star Wars books enjoy obviously a wider audience. So just to get responses from people as varied as like 5th and 6th graders who are reluctant readers, to adults who are just, reading a book on their lunch break. It's cool to see that, you've written a book that is difficult to put down, because those tend to be my favorite kind of books to read.
That's excellent. A friend of mine is also an author, and he kind of sent me a little message, and he asked, Joe is known for his soundtracks he writes to, when he writes, and he usually posts them online for readers to take a look at. Did you get a chance to do one for Lockdown?
No, I didn't. I actually dismantled the blog that I had for a little while. I don't really have a web presence right now. I do have songs, though. Somebody had asked me, what are the songs for Maul, because is there a playlist? And there are a few songs that are sort of, song titles and stuff that are actually referred to within the book itself. I think there's a chapter called From the Land of the Ice and Snow, which is deliberate reference to the Immigrant Song by Led Zeppelin. Yeah. But there's other songs that I was listening to sort of as I wrote it, because things just come to mind. Like certain scenes suggest certain songs. Everything from like 1920s Blind Willie Johnson blues song. There's a song called Jesus Make My... Make My Dying Bed, which is basically just what it means to sort of take a life. And one of the characters sort of has these thoughts running through his head as he's about to potentially give up his life. Like, what does it mean in my time of dying, which is a Led Zeppelin version of that. There's a Metallica song called Damage Incorporated.
Oh, yeah. Good song.
I sort of see that as a sort of bathtub crank version of the Imperial March. If you listen to the beginning of that song, it almost sounds like if you took John Williams and gave him some crystal meth, he would come up with something like that. So it's like dun 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 dun. So
that's great.
A really good Johnny Cash song called "The Devil's Right Hand," which I sort of thought would be a cool. If you hear the 20th Century Fox fanfare come up, and then it kicked right into this sort of sparse Johnny Cash number, sort of introducing the character, what Maul basically represents in this story for me, which is this sort of like walking weapon in a lot of ways. So there are a few songs that definitely were running through my head as I was going through editing it.
So talk to us, if you can, a little bit about this is connected to Darth Plagueis in many ways. How was the collaboration there, and how much did you have to refer back to that novel?
I actually was really privileged to be able to refer back to that novel a lot. And I say privileged just because I think James Luceno did an amazing job with Darth Plagueis. I think a lot of people, like, that was sort of their favorite ever expanded universe book, and with good reason. I think it did so many things right. Politically, a super smart book, just Machiavellian in the best possible way. You sort of saw these two, powerhouses going head to head in what sort of amounts to the Watergate tapes of the Star Wars universe. These guys who are just intensely ambitious and not above certainly betraying one another and just scheming and plotting intelligently. And what does that look like, sort of be inside the corridors of power, Star Wars wise? I really, really wanted to get Plagueis and Sidious's voices right for the scenes here. And I just kept going back. There was a period of, weeks where I was just driving around with Darth Plagueis, the audiobook, in my car stereo, just because I wanted to just kind of I wanted this to sort of be a reflection of what was going on there as well. Maul is obviously in that book as well, to a certain extent, and I felt like I really wanted to sort of see, it would be this sort of seamless experience where you could see him sort of stepping out of Darth Plagueis. Obviously the timeline's not going to line up completely, but seeing him stepping out of that book and sort of into this book, and they could be together enough that you could see both of them sort of coexisting. So I really found myself going back to that book a lot.
It shows the voice is certainly consistent, and which is very cool. And then it keeps the verisimilitude intact, which I certainly appreciate.
Yeah, it was, and James was actually really just useful in the early planning stages of the book when we looped him into a series of emails back and forth talking about, like, and I don't want to give away too much about what Maul's doing in the prison, but, like, what is it, how can we connect this? And, what would be realistic as far as what we could expect from him at this point? What would he be sharing with his master? What would, what kind of mission would he be dispatched on? Who would know what, when, all that kind of thing. Obviously, James has just come up with a lot of that stuff for the book, and he was super helpful in the process of sort of plotting out what that was going to look like.
Well, the father and son relationship I do really enjoy in this book. It is certainly non-traditional in many ways, but no less fascinating. And I don't want to give away any spoilers because there are certainly some nice surprises, especially at the end when things get very macabre, which I really enjoyed. But just talk maybe briefly about Siddiqui, if that's how you pronounce it, and the inspiration behind her.
Well, I've always sort of enjoyed writing strong female characters. It's just been a thing that I've always thought, there's a lot of mileage in these strong characters, these strong female characters, these women that are especially in this book. Siddiqui's the warden of the prison, and she's just a very, very ambitious and very intelligent individual. She's got things set up very much for her own advantage within this prison, which is that, she and her brother have designed this environment where there's an algorithm that matches inmates to fight one another to the death, and the algorithm is designed to just create the most exciting battle imaginable. You're going to take opponents with traits that are going to create the best, most thrilling fight. And as a result, people are, they're making all this money in the intergalactic gambling trade, betting on the outcomes of these fights. And it's very much a financial, decision that she's got set up. But she lives, her residence is part of this prison as well. Her offices are there. And so she's going to have to be very, very tough and very pragmatic, and certainly just very relentless in pursuit of what, just trying to maximize her profits here by watching these inmates kill each other. So she's cold, and she's always got an angle to the very end. She's a survivor, and it was gratifying for me to have a character like that in the middle of all these really sort of hardscrabble human and non-human, inmate species. You've got this female warden, and you'd expect maybe some degree of fragility or at least vulnerability there, but exactly the opposite. She's as tough as any of them, and she's unflappable in a lot of ways. She's no one's fool, which is great to see. Yeah. And I want to ask, because we talked about this with Martha Wells, and then we like to look at things through a critical lens here on Coffee with Kenobi. What's the impetus perhaps for the concept of a female antagonist versus a male protagonist? Not often is Maul considered a protagonist, but because did you ever think about having it be a male, or was there any kind of because that kind of stuff can sometimes leave you feeling empty, but it doesn't happen here. You actually pulled off very, very well, which isn't easy to do without falling into
using sex or sexual tension. You make it about these characters, not about their gender, even though they're strong in the genders that they represent. So how did that come about for you?
I think you want to, it kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier about what does it mean to write conflict that doesn't leave the reader sort of, cold or doesn't basically feel like too much, like deciding early on, like what's the advantage going to be for both of these characters so you really aren't going to be able to predict who's going to come out on top. Siddiqui is she's tough, but she's also politically very smart. There's a series of conversations that she has with the Galactic Gambling Commissioner, and he's always sort of coming in and sort of threatening to shut her down. But she sort of has a whole card that she holds on to play at the end, and you get the feeling that she really never goes into a fight that she doesn't pretty much know how the outcome is going to be. And that makes it interesting, I think, for the reader, because there can be a surprise at the end. It can be, so I didn't see that coming, or I thought it was just going to be a physical power struggle, or whatever it is. Like, how many different ways can this conflict be resolved in an interesting way that it doesn't necessarily have to go the way we expected it to? Her character, because she is so overtly in a position of power in this prison, I almost felt like you've got essentially an all-male, group of guards, and inmates. So her being in the position of power, I mean, if you want, there's always a risk of becoming too analytical about this stuff, but it could be viewed as...
Not for an English teacher.
it can be viewed as potentially kind of emasculating if you're used to being the top dog and now you're in a prison and the person who's running the prison and literally holds all the cards is a female. So what's that going to look like as far as, gender conflict? How is that going to make you rethink your own thoughts or your own sense of confidence about yourself, whether you're a convicted murderer or a fighter or a pit fighter, whatever you are. This woman, has the upper hand, and she certainly isn't reluctant to remind you of that she's in authority, and that she's not vulnerable, and that you are in a position of being submissive before in that. She literally holds your life in her hands. So, I mean, how is that going to work itself out? So Maul has at least one or two scenes where he's sort of face to face with Siddiqui in her office, and she's has no problem reminding him that she's in charge, but he still manages to use the situation to his own advantage, just because he's very canny. He's just very, very aware of what's going on, even more so than she is, and I think maybe she comes to realize that throughout the course of the book.
Well, great answer. That's again what a perk for Corey and I to be able to read an amazing book like this and ask you, because I couldn't help as I do teach literature, so I think about things like that, and hearing your designs for that makes perfect sense. So I appreciate you indulging me.
Oh, thanks. No problem. My pleasure.
Well, Joe, we're curious to know too. You've done some pretty amazing work here in the Star Wars universe, but we're curious too to know about your next project coming up. What are you most excited about in the Star Wars novels?
Yeah, I don't right now. I don't have another Star Wars book coming up. I mean, we certainly had conversations about it, and it'll be interesting to see if and when that happens. I have as I said before, I've sort of had this new sort of career of writing books for younger readers, young adult and middle grade. Middle grade in particular is exciting for me because that's the age my kids are. Like I said, my son is 12 and my daughter's 10. And so they're now reading some of the books that I'm writing. So I have a middle grade book coming out in March. And basically this is it's called Game Over Pete Watson. And it's about a kid who finds his dad's sort of 80s era video console, like an Atari, down in the basement. And he needs money, so he sells it at a garage sale, and later finds out that his father actually works for the CIA, and that the console was sort of his connecting porthole to the CIA database. So he sort of inadvertently compromised America's total security base, and there's an arch villain who sort of buys the thing and ends up launching this attack with the information that's on there. So, but it's actually funny. It's a funny. There's actually some illustrations in it. They got a really good illustrator to do pictures for it. So, but it's a middle grade reader, the same sort of age group maybe that Diary of a Wimpy Kid or something like that would be. And I have a young adult novel coming out next year. It's sort of about a couple of kids at a high-end New England prep school who are actually con artists, and they're not at all who they say they are. And it's almost like The Sting or Dirty Rotten Scoundrels set at a prep school. So it's called Perp School. And that's coming out next year.
Those both sound incredibly cool.
I know, that sounds great.
The first one, I'm thinking, hello, Pixar, are you listening to this?
Yeah, right. That's
awesome. I cannot wait to read that. That's going to be very cool.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Well, We again appreciate you sharing your time with us. And if people want to get in touch with you, ask you questions, do you have a preferred method for that?
I like I said, I don't really have a web presence right now at all. I think the best way for them to get in touch with me is probably through Del Rey, either through the Savudu website, which is a really good website that they have, or just through the main like Random House website. They have contact information for me that way. It's probably the best way to do it.
Awesome.
Joe, you've been amazing and love picking your brain. And now we've got our 5 questions that we share everyone. It looks like your coffee's getting pretty low, so we better get to these 5 questions here. And they're the kind of questions we ask all of our Star Wars guests. It's neat to see the commonality. It's very much inspired by Inside the Actors Studio with James Lipton. So I'll go ahead and ask the first one for you. What is your favorite Star Wars movie?
It depends on the day of the week. I got to say, it's either Empire or New Hope. For the longest time, it was Empire, and I still love Empire. But I got to say, the first one just does so many things right that I have to give you the answer of the day is A New Hope.
It's a good answer.
Excellent, excellent. Next question is, who is your favorite character?
Oh, they say everybody starts out loving Luke Skywalker, and you get older, you want to be Han Solo, and then later on, everybody realizes all they really are is Darth Vader. So,
nice answer.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I've never heard that. I love that.
That's good.
Vader, probably. And I'm not quite sure why necessarily, except for somebody, there was a question that was just like, if you could do another Star Wars, supernatural Star Wars novel, what would you do? And I started thinking about, what if you did some really like gothic novel with Vader, just because so much of what we talk about in Gothic, like the way that Victorians wrote Gothic, or the way that the German authors like E.T.A. Hoffmann wrote Gothic literature, and you've got Vader, who's an intensely Gothic individual. I mean, he's locked up inside a walking coffin, essentially. There's something very Edgar Allan Poe-ish about his whole existence. So, right now, for whatever reason, I would love to write a Vader. I got to say Vader.
Oh, I hope you get that chance for sure. That would be amazing. What is your favorite line of dialogue or film moment?
There's so many good lines of dialogue, and then because Vader was my answer for the last one, I'll go with the Vader quote from Jedi, which I guess people tend to quote, the first movie a lot, and the second movie has got, I love you, I know, and stuff like that. But I think one of my favorite Vader moments is where, whoever it is, one of the Moffs tells Vader, like, my men are working as hard as they can to achieve, the work, and Vader goes, perhaps I can find new ways of motivating them.
Yeah,
I love that. I love that line. It's so understated, and it just says everything you need to know about what it means to be sinister and in charge.
I remember I saw that movie the first day it came out. I think I was probably 11, and I remember when Vader said that, everybody laughed really hard.
Yeah, it's funny. That's an interesting observation, because to say it is funny, but at the same time, it tells you everything you need to know about Vader at that moment.
That's right.
So, Joe, if you collect, what is your favorite collectible that you own?
I have a few of the original Kenner action figures, which I really enjoy. I used to have a ton of them, and somehow they all got sold at a garage sale when I was on my way to college. I had nothing to do with that. They just came home one day and they were all gone.
Oh, no.
Been sold for like $1. I think my favorite thing that I have right now is when Death Troopers came out, the members of the 501st built a Death Troopers helmet, like a full Stormtrooper helmet that's like has the blaster marks on it, and it's the fractured lens, and there's some blood on it. It's actually it's a wearable helmet, and I ended up getting this thing, and I brought it home with me, and my kids won't even let me put it out. It's in the back room with a piece of black fabric over it because it's so scary. But every once in a while, I get it out and put it on and freak everybody out. So that's probably takes the cake. Yeah,
that's outstanding. What particular themes or messages about the Star Wars saga resonate or speak to you?
I think that for me, what makes Star Wars work, what makes it still work for this generation, as well as like their parents who watched the movies too, is that we love to see characters. We love to see transformation happen. It's very gratifying to see a character like Luke Skywalker, or even Han Solo in the first film, like start out in one place and end up someplace really, really radically different as far as what circumstances sort of change who they are and what they believe. And because Star Wars takes place against an environment of alien species and crazy technology and unexplored fictional realms, we tend to a lot of times just see that. But the fact is, like, I think the reason it stays relevant is it is a story of transformation. It is a story of renewal. And even when you've got a character like Maul, arguably an anti-hero, but we want to see things. We want to see him sort of appreciating the circumstances and adapting and changing and maybe coming out a little bit different. Certainly the movies handle that very well. The original trilogy just takes us with some very, very humble beginnings, and we end up in a very different place. So that whole, like, hero's journey, the whole idea of what transformation looks like, I think works very well. And to me, that's always been one of the things that I keep going back to and think about, why did I enjoy this character so much? I think it's the journey that they go through is gratifying to see and be a part of.
Very well said. Very well said. Well, Joe Schreiber, we were, again, thrilled to share a cup of coffee with you. Maul-Lockdown comes out on January 28th. People will not be disappointed. It's action. It's intensity. It's Darth Maul like you've never seen him before. It's a book you're not going to want to put down, and you're going to be clamoring for a sequel, no doubt. I know that I am.
Thank you.
If you'd like to respond to a question of our show, have a comment, or just want to say hello, send us an email or MP3 at feedback@coffeewithkenobi.com. Or if you'd have a specific question or a comment for either of us individually, email us at danz@coffeewithkenobi.com or coryc@coffeewithkenobi.com. Or visit us at coffeewithkenobi.com, contact us section, or comment on one of our stories featured on the site. If you enjoy the show, please write a review in iTunes. You can also like our show at Facebook at facebook.com/coffeewithkenobi, as well as keep up to date on our Twitter feed at twitter.com/coffeewithkenobi. You can also find us on Tumblr at coffeewithkenobi.tumblr.com. If you enjoy the jazz music, download the album Eye to Eye by Steve Torok on iTunes.
Give the evacuation code signal.
This podcast is not endorsed by the Walt Disney Company or Lucasfilm Limited and is intended for entertainment and informational purposes only. The official Star Wars website can be found at www.starwars.com. Star Wars, all names and sounds, and any other Star Wars-related items are registered trademarks and or copyrights of Disney or their respective trademark and copyright holders. All original content of this podcast is the intellectual property of Coffee with Kenobi, unless otherwise indicated.
There's no one here. Move along. Move along.